this evening. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has called the bombing terrible, while the director of the World Health Organization says he strongly condemns the attack. Now, the Israeli military says it's investigating the incident. Now, I can completely understand why everybody assumes that this was an Israeli missile, but there have been lots of missiles being sent from Gaza into Israel today. So until we know the actual facts, I'm not sure you can answer this with a yes or no, but I'll leave my panel to do what they want to do. Harriett Baldwin used to be a Foreign Office Minister. I don't know whether Israel was ever under your remit, but obviously, a terrible situation is developing this evening.
The whole situation since the attack on Israel last weekend has just appalled the world, and this has been a deliberate terrorist act by Hamas into Israel, designed to terrify and undermine the right of the state of Israel to exist. And I fully support what the Prime Minister was saying yesterday, that we must 100% make sure that we send a very strong message that we stand with Israel, that they have the right to defend themselves. And of course, they must do it in the kind of approach that we would expect to see, which is one which targets the terrorists and makes sure that to as much as possible they give ample warning to civilians and ensure that the loss of life, which has already been far too high, is something which they have at the aim to minimise. And so we must stand with Israel's right to exist and their right to defend themselves.
But how, if this is an Israeli missile attack on a hospital, how could that be justified?
Well, I think you started your question with if, and as you said, we haven't heard the full facts yet. We know, for example, that one of the things that Hamas had been doing with aid that had been given to Palestinians in Gaza to improve their water supply, that they were taking the water pipes and creating missiles from those water pipes. So we do have to know the full facts. And I know that when the Prime Minister visits Israel later this week, he will be conveying a message from us here in the UK about our solidarity with Israel, but also a message about how important it is that it is Hamas that is targeted here, and that Hamas, who use hospitals and schools as human shields, we know that, and are using the entire population of Gaza as a human shield. But
that couldn't justify an attack which kills 500 people, could it?
And as you say, we don't know the full facts.
Okay. Charlotte Nichols.
I mean, I think first and foremost, it's a horrifying thing to hear. And obviously, until the facts have been ascertained, it's very difficult to apportion blame. But whoever is responsible for it, that much is objectively true. I think one of the things that's been very difficult over the last week or so is these discussions, and obviously it came up a lot in the debate that we had in Parliament yesterday, around the importance of Israel acting in accordance with international law. Now, Israel is within this conflict. They're obviously fighting against an organisation, Hamas, a terrorist organisation, a non-state actor that is not acting within international law, and that much is true right from the very get-go of this, and the terrorist atrocity that they unleashed, which has sparked all of this. But Israel has to, as a state actor and as part of the international community, be held to those standards. And if it is ascertained that it was an Israeli strike and that it was a deliberate strike, I think there are questions that are going to have to be answered. But this kind of takes me back to what my question was in the chamber yesterday about the importance of finding a political solution to this conflict, because this isn't going to be solved militarily. There has got to be some sort of diplomatic solution. There's got to be a way of bringing in international actors to call for restraint, to call for international law to be adhered to make sure that it's being adhered to, and to strain every single sinew possible for some sort of peace, because the situation as is just can't be sustained. It's not in anyone's interests, and seeing civilians harmed on either side of this conflict is just heartbreaking.
Rachel.
Well, it does appear that this is an Israeli strike, because you can't imagine that Hamas would bomb itself.
Can you not?
No, bomb Gaza. No, I don't think Hamas would. Even Hamas, a terrorist organisation, let's say it is, would bomb a hospital that's got how many? 500? Is it 500 dead already?
Well, that is the quoted
figure.
500.
I think the difficulty we have here is, I think what our two MPs have said on both sides of the House. All of that is true, but we are in a terrible situation whereby the West has licensed Israel to defend itself quite correctly, because the state of Israel exists and it has to be protected, and people have got to stand with Israel. That is all understood. The problem we have here is we see from what's happened in the hospital tonight that it's impossible to do a precision strike on Gaza. All that it looks like to the world's eyes is collective punishment, thereby crossing the line in international law. And the other problem we have here is we also want to see Hamas, a terrorist organisation that's brutalised its own people in Gaza, rooted out. But the problem is you're then fighting an Islamic extremist ideal, not a population. You're fighting an idea. You're not fighting individual terrorists. And that, to my mind, the military solution, as you've just said, is doomed to failure, because you're fighting an idea, you're fighting zeal. Hamas means zeal. You can never destroy the zeal of those in the occupied territories to want freedom and justice for themselves.
Jack Blanchard.
It's terrible scenes that we're seeing coming out of Gaza, of course, and unfortunately it was always going to be this way. Once it became very clear that Israel was going to have to respond in a very severe military way, and we knew that they were going to, this is the start of the sort of scenes that are going to play out. This will not be the final scene like this, I'm afraid, over the days ahead and the weeks ahead, and you have to wonder how much of this Hamas has actually gamed out. They will not have undertaken those awful atrocities without thinking about what comes next, and they will have known that what comes next is a very severe military response. And you have to fear that these sorts of scenes are going to radicalise more people against the Israelis, and you just fear for
and not just in Gaza.
Well, indeed, and we've seen this play out before, haven't we? After 9/11, and the way that the West reacted to those terrible atrocities, and of course there was a military reaction to that, and pretty big strategic mistakes were made by the West in the years after that came back to escalate that crisis in a way that carried on for many, many years, and you just fear that something similar could play out here. That doesn't mean, of course, that Israel shouldn't be defending itself. This is a state that's come under unbelievable attack, and it has to do something to try and shut down the Hamas ability.
But this is the difficulty, isn't it? Because there are 200 hostages, we now understand, in Gaza being held hostage by Hamas. I'm not a military expert, but you can't rescue hostages from the air. There has to be some sort of ground operation or some sort of negotiation. Well, Hamas don't strike me as the kind of people that negotiate in a traditional sort of hostage-taking scenario. So therefore, the Israelis have only got one option, to go in on the ground. Otherwise, the hostages will never be rescued.
And you have to assume that is what's going to happen, although whether it leads to the rescuing of hostages, who knows? I mean, it's hard to be optimistic about the military outcome. And if you listen to military experts about what a ground invasion of Gaza actually involves and what it actually looks like, it sounds simple to say if you've got a big military and it's not that vast a piece of land, but it will be very, very intense and very, very extreme for both sides, and could drag on for a very, very long time indeed. And that sort of military scene playing out on our screens again and again, as I say, I fear is only going to radicalise more people, and as you say, not just in that part of the world.
And therefore serve Hamas's purposes, if it does radicalise more people to their cause. I mean, even though the numbers, if you look at them, I mean, the Israelis got a standing army of, over 100,000. They've got reservists of 350,000. I think in total they've got about 550,000 possible fighters in their force, if you count in the reservists.
Which out of a
Hamas,
population of 9 million is quite a lot, isn't it?
Well, everyone does military service, men and women, as you know. But Hamas has got, 25,000, they think. But therefore, I think you're right to flag this up as Israel Jack, Israel may be falling into a trap. We've got to expect that Hamas wants a ground invasion. They want the troops to come in, and there will be booby traps. They will have planned for this as well.
But I just want to be clear, Israel can't just sit there and do nothing when something like this has happened to their people. So,
but that's the question no one can answer. If you say, okay, well, they can't do nothing, but if apart from a ground invasion, what other choice do they have? That's the problem, isn't it?
I mean, I would just like to point out we have seen this week, and it was again something that was raised in the debate yesterday, Qatar acting as brokers for Russia to release Ukrainian hostages that they had there, and that's something that has been successful. I think there are actors within the region that within the international community are people that could act as brokers. I mean, I worry that with ground invasion that the hostages end up being caught in the crossfire just as much as Palestinian civilians will end up being caught in it. If what we want is the hostages to be brought back as soon as possible, I want Hamas to release them unconditionally immediately. But it might be that actually the quickest route to that is not through military action. It might be through some sort of brokered discussion, as difficult as it sounds to say that.
Because on the face of it, it seemed a little odd for the Israelis to warn people to move to the south of Gaza. So you think, well, any hostages in the north of Gaza will have been moved. So when they come into the north of Gaza, there's no one there. The hostages aren't there. So what's the point?
Well, it's obviously a completely impossible situation, and I know that the Israeli government will be under huge pressure from their population, rightly so, to do everything they can to save these hostages. It's why they've been taken, and it's just an unbearable.
And we should remember that apparently 10 of these hostages are British citizens, which hasn't had the coverage in this country that I kind of think it ought to. I mean, Jack, you're the media representative here. Why is that?
I think the British government are working very, very, very hard on this behind the scenes, along the lines that Charlotte is suggesting. They're not keen to talk about this in public. They don't think that's helpful, and often it's not helpful in hostage situations to talk about it too much in public. But I can assure you that for James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, and others in his department, this is one of the top priorities, and I think Qatar does play an absolutely crucial role here, and potentially Britain does too, because we're very close to the Qataris in the grand scheme of things, and Qatar, of course, play host to some senior Hamas figures and have close links to them, and so there is a channel there, and as Charlotte says, it seems to me that's a much more realistic way of getting people home unharmed than sending in people all guns blazing and hoping to find them.
Well, it's been an understandably rather sombre start to the hour. Chris, thank you very much indeed for your question. We'll move on to another related subject in just a moment, but do keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
With me on the panel are Harriett Baldwin, Conservative MP, Charlotte Nichols, Labour MP, Jack Blanchard, UK editor of Politico, and Rachel Johnson, LBC presenter and writer. Let's go to another call. It's from Tony in Saddleworth. Hi, Tony.
Evening, Ian. Evening, panel. Just a quick question for you. Should we, without delay and any more drop of blood, should we start bringing the Palestinian refugees to this country? Maybe just the women and the children, but this is what genuine refugees actually look like, and they can all be traceable. So should we be evacuating them now and welcoming them like we did the Ukrainian wives and children?
I suppose one question there is, how on earth do you get them out if you do decide to go down that road? And during his speech to the SNP conference in Aberdeen today, Scottish First Minister Humza Yousaf made this demand of the UK government.
They should immediately begin work on the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme for those in Gaza who want to and, of course, are able to leave. And when they do so, Scotland is willing to be the first country in the UK to offer safety and sanctuary to those who are caught up in these terrible attacks.
Rachel Johnson, good idea?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I really do. I think that, I know we saw net immigration figures spike at 660,000 over the last counting period because of Hong Kongers and because of Afghan refugees from Afghanistan, and also, of course, the Ukrainian refugees came in. Those were one-offs that really, really bumped up the figures. I think this is an existential crisis, not just for the Middle East, it's for the world. This is the time when Britain should open its doors. The Palestinians are, they're like, somebody described them to me as the Jews of the Gaza Strip. They are super, in a good way, meaning that as a compliment. They're educated. There are 5 universities in Gaza. Where else are they going to go? We've seen that the Arab states, the border crossing Rafah hasn't been opened for them. Where else are they going to go? But as you point out, how will they get to us?
Charlotte.
And
sorry, Harriet.
I would also just say, steady on, because my understanding is the population is 2.5 million.
2.2.
So
not all of them, and all of them will want to come. But isn't it a good gesture at least?
I think what we did with the Syrian refugees was very appropriate. So we had a scheme that was run by the UN, where the UN identified particularly vulnerable people who really had no other choices, and who were in camps outside Syria. And the UK has been very welcoming to 20,000. What I think, when I said steady on, I think these things should not be articulated in the way that implies that we would be able to take large numbers, because we have, as you said, accommodated over 100,000 Ukrainian refugees in our homes. We have welcomed people fleeing Hong Kong, and we've had this successful Syrian vulnerable people programme, and the programme for people who'd worked with the UK government in Afghanistan. So I think it's important to, when these schemes are announced, to make sure that the numbers are manageable by the UK.
Jack?
I think it would be more practical to offer support to the countries that are very close by to take in large numbers of refugees and try and make sure that they can deal with that in a better supported way than often happens in these terrible situations. It's hard to imagine that Britain could take the numbers of people that might be required to get out of Gaza very quickly over the next few days and weeks. We, as you say, can't really get any flights in and out there, and if we could, how many people realistically could we bring over here in a short space of time? I would have thought we'd be better focusing on Egypt and other countries around there about how they could take on very large numbers of people in safe conditions, because often the camps that people come into can be very, very bad.
But if you look at the other countries, we're talking about Jordan and Lebanon, which are already full of refugees from Syria, so that they won't want to take any more, will they?
I appreciate that, but I think what other option is there really? If you're looking at the numbers of people we're talking about, I mean, it might make people feel good, and there might be certain people that we, as Harriett says, who specifically we could help out of Gaza, but the sheer scale of this, it's hard to think that flying everyone over to Britain is going to be a realistic solution.
Charlotte?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that anyone's suggesting for a second that, you know, the kind of all 2.2 million people are going to, you know, even want to come here in the first place. And of course we should be taking in refugees. I think first and foremost, there are thousands of people who do already have family links to the UK. It's not difficult to think that their families would be more than happy to take them in and to provide them shelter and accommodation before you even get into the same sorts of schemes that have been put in place for example, Ukrainian refugees. I've already had emails from constituents who, having been very moved by the scenes that they've seen, have offered up rooms in their houses if we're able to get people out. Now, of course, you know, it will be prioritising certain cases, again, people that have got some sort of link to the UK or people that have got certain vulnerabilities that mean that we're best placed to look after them. But the one thing that I would say in and amongst those considerations is also making sure that if they do come here and if we are able to provide them sanctuary either in the UK or with our international partners in the region, that they have the right to return when this is over, because that's something that has long been an issue for Palestinian refugees from 1948 onwards who fled the land during various wars that have happened over that time and have not been able to go back. We have to make sure that if they're going to be offered sanctuary somewhere else, that when this is over, that they do have the right to return.
I may be putting words in his mouth, but I can imagine Nigel Farage's reaction to this idea, where he would then quote an opinion poll, I think it was in the Sunday Times or maybe in the Mail on Sunday, where some polling organisation polled the people of Gaza as to whether they supported Hamas or not. And we like to think that they don't necessarily, even though they voted for them. But 49% do. And I can imagine Nigel Farage then saying, well, OK, you want to bring in refugees from Palestine? Half of them support a terrorist organisation. And this could be an incredibly divisive thing to do. Anybody want to?
I mean, it definitely could, although I would say, like, how good is the polling in Palestine?
No idea.
Frankly, I'm
They
a
haven't had an
little bit
election since
suspicious
2006.
of the methodology behind such a poll. So I wouldn't necessarily.
I'm not sure Gaza exists.
Indeed. So I would be a little unsure about this stat. But I mean, the broader point you make is, of course, an important one. Anything like this has to have public buy-in, or it's going to cause problems in our own society here. And so you have to take the people with you on doing that. And you saw with Ukraine the outpouring of support people felt for that cause. And I think particularly because it was Europe and it was closer to us, people felt that particularly keenly. I do think that if with something like this, you just need to make sure that the people are on side. Yes, I do.
And how would you go about that, Rachel?
Well, it is very difficult. I mean, these aren't, you know, actually in terms of nationality, Palestinians, they're Gazans. I mean, they live within Gaza, and it does strike me, if you talk about even right to return as a way of maybe selling it in to the British public, what would they have where to return to if Israel carries out an air, land and sea invasion and carries on destroying at least the north of Gaza? I do feel that, you know, other countries should say, you know, it shouldn't just be Britain saying we will open our doors to, let's say, women and children, which won't necessarily threaten the Farage's tendency, thinking that we're going to be, you know, seeding terrorists into our own land and population if we do invite them and do welcome them in the way that we did Ukrainians. Maybe just, you know, baby steps with this one, obviously, to suddenly announce you're going to host 2.2 million Palestinian refugees, half of whom support Hamas, is not going to fly with the British public.
If the United Nations has a role in anything nowadays, surely it has to have a role in this kind of thing, which, as we know, it did in Syria. You think, well, there will be other countries, not just Britain, who would presumably want to take some refugees, and that has to be coordinated by, I would have thought, an international organisation. And if they can't do that, what is the point of them? On that controversial bombshell, we will move on to other subjects in just a moment. It's 8:30 on LBC, time for the news headlines with Charlotte Morgan.
The Palestinian Health Ministry claims hundreds of people have been killed in an explosion on a hospital in Gaza. Rishi Sunak's expected to travel to Israel later this week as concerns grow over a humanitarian crisis. Former Tory Minister Peter Bone has had his Conservative whip removed after allegations of bullying and sexual misconduct against him were upheld. The MP for Wellingborough says the claims made by a former staff member are untrue. And prosecutors are looking to recharge the actor Alec Baldwin with involuntary manslaughter. It's in connection with the shooting of a cinematographer who died when a prop gun went off on set in 2021. LBC weather, showers pushing northwards across western parts overnight with a low of 3.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:33 on LBC. We have with us Rachel Johnson. We have Jack Blanchard, UK editor of Politico, and also the co-host of the podcast named
Politics at Jack and Sam's every Sunday night.
Can't give you much more of a plug than that.
Thank you.
Now, I've just asked Charlotte and Harriett if they're doing anything that they would like to plug. We'll plug Harriet's after the next break. But Charlotte, you want to plug magic mushrooms?
Yeah. I've been doing
a change of tone.
It's much better than a podcast, isn't it? I feel like I've really
I've been doing a lot of campaigning work over the last year or so around the rescheduling of psychedelics, which sounds very boring, but is actually about the sort of potential revolution happening in mental health treatment for things like treatment-resistant depression and PTSD.
Have you been on his show? Because he's really into psychedelics, apparently. I mean, not in a bad way.
Yeah, but it's actually the science is there, and it's what's so disheartening within the UK that it's almost impossible to even research. So there's a new cross-party think tank that I've just got on board with that's been set up called the Centre for Evidence-Based Drugs Policy. Really encourage people to take a look at some of the work that they're doing around this at the moment, so that we can make sure that for things that we haven't had new treatments sort of brought in since the 1960s for, things like SSRIs for treatment of the most common mental health conditions. That is, 70-year-old pharmacology. There's a lot more that we could be doing for people and to help address the mental health crisis in this country.
Have you got cross-party support for this initiative?
Yeah, so the Centre for Evidence-Based Drugs Policy is a cross-party initiative. So we've got MPs on board like Crispin Blunt from the Conservative side. It actually started out life as the Conservative Drug Action Reform Group. So very much cross-party, got some Lib Dems involved, but primarily actually a lot of scientists, including people like Professor Nutt, who is, one of the most eminent medical professionals in this area. So all very exciting.
We shall watch with interest. Right, we have a call from Ulf in Hamburg. Ulf, guten Abend.
Guten Abend, Ian. Good evening, panel. Recently, the German finance minister, Mr. Lindner, gave a speech in London, and he told the UK, if you want better trade relationships, just call us. I don't think this means anything beyond Mr. Lindner being master of the obvious. Does the panel agree or not? By the way, whom would you call? Whom does he mean by us, Brussels or Berlin?
Well, that is a very interesting question, because I can remember during all of the Brexit shenanigans, they seem years ago now, David Davis was saying, well, we can have a trade deal with Germany, which of course you can't, because it has to be with the EU. Jack, I have to say this was a speech that I missed on your daily newsletter.
Well, you were probably reading the wrong one, because we in our Brussels edition of Playbook, we do cover European trade very closely. We also have a trade newsletter if you want to subscribe.
Oh my goodness!
Anyway, I know it's a very interesting thing. I assume he must have been talking when he said us. He must have meant Brussels, because really there is only one way that Britain can radically improve its trading relationship with European nations, and that is going round the whole block on Brexit again, which is probably not going to happen, but I think most European nations are reasonably happy with where Britain has ended up on Brexit. They think they got a pretty good deal out of Boris Johnson. In fact, they did, let's face it. And they're not unhappy with where it's landed. And so for Britain to try and improve its trading relationship now with European nations probably means some major concession around the single market and free movement.
So what was his motivation in saying that then?
You'd have to ask him. I don't speak good enough German.
Well, I do, but he's not here, so I can't. Harriett?
Yeah, I think I totally agree with what Jack said, is that you can't do these individual nation trade deals, unfortunately. And as we saw with the negotiations, the EU drove a pretty hard bargain. And I think that, while trading relations with every trading bloc should be kept under review for seeing how we can improve them, it would not be something that would be as simple as Kemi Badenoch and the German minister agreeing a deal together and selling it to their parliaments, because obviously the EU has competency there.
Charlotte?
Who wouldn't want us to have a closer trading relationship with the largest trading bloc that is also geographically the closest to us? I think when we look at the way things are going economically at the moment, clearly that strikes me as a pretty sensible proposal.
I do think it's quite meaningful that the German finance minister, Germany is the largest economy in the EU, that should make a speech saying that. But it's a bit like what was the quote from the Talleyrand on the French Revolution? What did they mean by that? And I can't.
Too early to tell.
Too early to tell. I can't quite work it out.
Well, isn't it because Germany's slowing down? We're Germany's second largest trading partner. Germany wants to, get growth back. This is all to do with cars and making it easier for us to sell our cars to the EU, and because of the restrictions on country of origin, we've been selling less cars into Europe. So they want fewer. Oh, Ian. And so basically they want to, make it all very much faster and easier with higher volumes. But then he should be making a
speech to his colleagues in Brussels, shouldn't he?
I know, but this was clever. This was a direct appeal to us because, this country needs growth. Our exports have fallen since we raised trade values.
No, actually they haven't. Our exports to the EU have gone up.
Not maybe in values, but not in volumes, or not in volumes, and not in values. I've looked at those figures as well. We're down 11%, according to the ONS. I thought since we left the EU. Jack, are you going to correct me?
I'm not wading in on a stats battle, but I will tell you there is a specific ludicrous new tariff coming in at the end of this year on electric vehicles between Britain and the EU due to the Brexit agreement, which means that
I rest my case.
Both sides will be penalised with 10% tariffs on these super modern new cars unless they can come to some agreement to waive what is about to happen. The automotive industry on both sides is doing its nut, going, we all want to sell more electric cars to each other. Why are you doing this? And they're both looking at each other with gritted teeth going, because that's what the Brexit deal says. I assume that normally in Brexit, the day before something is about to happen, some big agreement is struck to extend the deadline for another few years.
That's the track record, isn't it?
That tends to be the way, some Christmas Eve announcement or something ruining journalists' festive turkey. But anyway, in the meantime, the industries are just sweating on it. And we keep getting to these cliff edges, and there'll be more of them.
Now, Ulf, as a representative of the European Union on this programme tonight, I want to know what you think. What is your finance minister up to?
I haven't got the foggiest. I mean, this didn't make any waves in Germany. Nobody cared. And,
well, it didn't make many waves here, but
why should it? Mr. Lindner is the chairman of a political party that just got kicked out of one state parliament and might be kicked out of more state parliaments for not breaching the 5% threshold. He's part of a government that can't decide whether they'd rather solve problems or rip each other's throats out. So it's so very busy with other things. I really don't know what he was up to. Really, it makes no sense. Maybe it was just a throwaway remark, and he's wondering now himself why he said this.
Well, it's good to hear that the German government's in the same state as the UK government, I suppose. Ulf, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, a follow-up text question from Kevin in Basingstoke, also on a European theme. Poland's Eurosceptic government looks set to be kicked out of office and replaced by Donald Tusk's pro-Brussels coalition. Nearly 4 years after Brexit happened, is the EU in the best health it's ever been in? Well, Rachel Johnson, you're a great fan of the EU, aren't you? Or you used to be, anyway.
You know, I'm a child of a Eurocrat. I went to the European school. I worked for the European Parliament. I tried to become a European MP.
The electorate fought back.
In 2019, we changed UK, as my husband calls it. Didn't win a single seat. It was a catastrophe. My brother was wafted into Downing Street on the zephyrs of nationalism, as well as the yearning for sovereignty and independence. All laudable things. Whether the EU is in its best health ever, I don't know. I haven't worked in Brussels for since the 90s. I do think it's a good thing that Donald Tusk could be taking power in Poland, and I think that is a sign that the centre-right tide may be turning the populist tide, and I for one applaud that, and I think that will make the EU a healthier place, yes.
Okay, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think it's potentially very good news for Poland and potentially very good news for the rest of us in a week that's been quite short of good news, actually. The previous government in Poland has obviously been, quite reactionary, right-wing, real issues around women's rights to access abortion, lots of quite troubling things that they've done in terms of social policy. So I think that, as Rachel said, this kind of populist, nationalist tide that over the last decade or so we've seen, not just in Europe, but in the US and other places, does seem like we're moving towards something a bit more progressive, which I would hope would be a good thing.
I would disagree with that, unfortunately. It's certainly a good result in Poland for democracy, because the ruling party was getting increasingly anti-democratic in its approach to the judiciary and other things. Like, regardless of what you think about the EU, most generally people don't want to see that. But I'm afraid that populist right-wing parties are on the up in many, many other parts of Europe. If you look in Germany and in Spain and in Italy,
France,
and indeed in France, there is very much a rising tide of support for that sort of politics. Harriett?
And if I could just sort of add a slightly different perspective, I'm a member of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We just elected a Polish president of our assembly. And I think it is really important that we recognise how important both European unity, but above all NATO unity is in the face of these increasing conflicts around the border, whether it's the heinous invasion of Ukraine, the kind of sabotage you've seen in terms of the pipelines in the Baltic Sea, or this appalling conflict now in Israel, the appalling attack on Israel, but other things like Syria, Kosovo, Moldova. There's trouble being caused all around the borders of the European countries and European NATO nation states, and we must be more united than ever. About our Western values.
Just going back to Israel, some breaking news. The Israeli Defense Force says its investigation into the explosion at a Gaza hospital killing hundreds has found that it was caused by a failed Hamas rocket launch and not by Israeli military forces. We'll obviously try and get more details on that and bring them to you as we get them. It's 8:45.
LBC, Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
The Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, Tzipi Hotovely.
If you care about the future of the Middle East, you want to have peace, you need to stand with us against Hamas.
But it's my understanding that it's Israel that's cut off the power and the water, Ambassador.
Israel is not targeting civilians. Hamas is using the electricity in Gaza that could have supplied the water supply for the Palestinian people of Gaza, but they're using it in order to create this whole manufacturing of rockets against cities in Israel. This is something that's happening on a daily basis, so blame Hamas.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio and on Global Player. LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:49. A little bit more on the this rocket that hit an Israeli a Gazan hospital, killing, it's said now, up to 800 people. An Israeli Defense Force spokesman has said this in the last few minutes. From the analysis of the IDF's operational systems, an enemy rocket barrage was launched towards Israel, which passed in the vicinity of the hospital when it was hit. According to intelligence information from a number of sources we have, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad terrorist organization is responsible for the failed fire that hit the hospital. Let's just get some quick reaction from our panel. Harriett, Baldwin.
Well, I think right at the beginning of the programme, Iain, you were wise to say we don't know what the facts are on this. And we've now heard the IDF line. And I'm sure that, people will realise just how important in this conflict it is not to jump to conclusions from immediate sources of information, and how we do need to again reiterate that it was the attack by Hamas into Israel last weekend that kicked off this conflict. And I think, as we heard from the Prime Minister in the Commons yesterday, we need to recognise that in this conflict, it is Israel that has been attacked, and that Israel has the right to defend itself. But it has said that it will do it in a way where they give ample warning to civilians. And so let's wait until all the facts are out there before jumping to conclusions.
And of course, Charlotte, there's going to be a war of words now, isn't there? Because I don't know how Israel proves it wasn't them, because you can imagine in Gaza right now that there may well be Hamas terrorists who are finding bits of Israeli rockets from elsewhere and then planting them in the hospital to make out that it was the Israelis. I don't know what the truth is.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the really difficult things here. That I'm not any kind of military expert, and I don't know how you would prove one way or the other who is responsible. But it goes back to, on a fundamental level, it is civilians that are paying the price here. Whoever it was that was responsible for this specific incident, there are hundreds of innocent people who have been killed as a result of it. There are hundreds of families that are going to be grieving, and I think it underlines how desperate the situation has become over the course of the last week, and how urgent it is that we find some sort of solution through this, a political solution to end the bloodshed.
Okay. Rachel?
Well, I think this is a classic example of the fog of war. I assumed, maybe wrongly, that it was an Israeli airstrike on Gaza. I could be wrong. But I think what this underlines is that if it was a Hamas rocket, it was a terrible blunder. Therefore, from either side, there cannot be a military solution to this dispute, this conflict.
Jack?
Yeah, you've now got both sides blaming each other for what is one of the worst atrocities we've seen in a very long time, and maybe one day it'll become clear. I do think, going back to your original caller who asked us for a yes or no answer on this, if you recall, I don't want to pick on the person, but I do think that kind of thinking in this kind of situation is exactly what we don't need. And you've seen it playing out on social media as well, people wanting to take a very, very definitive line on everything absolutely immediately. The second they see an image of something like, right, who's in the right and who's in the wrong.
And it all comes from their own perspective on this. If you're on the Palestinian side, you will believe one thing. If you're on the Israeli side, you'll believe another.
I think that you've got to look at one day, hopefully we'll know exactly what's happened at this hospital, this awful thing. But in the meantime, I think you've got to look at the bigger picture, which is that Hamas knew that when they launched these awful attacks, they would trigger this type of response from Israel. And in the end, with what the conflict that is going to unfold over the next few days and weeks and months, many, many civilians are going to die from rockets from both sides, and that is just a terrible situation. And all we can really do is try and contain the civilian deaths as best we can, and rather than picking on one incident and saying this side's responsible or that side's responsible for it.
See, Abby in Surrey, who fits into exactly the category that I was talking about there. She texts me about 10 times every evening and looks at it all through the prism of, well, Israel is awful, Palestine is great. She says, how do we know that the IDF is telling the truth about this incident? Well, at the moment we don't. We can't sit here and say that they are right. But, you've got to have some nuance on this. You can't just automatically assume that your side is on the side of the angels on this. Right, let's go to a text question on a very different subject from Brian in Ipswich. Is Greta Thunberg, like Just Stop Oil and Extinction Rebellion, actually ruining the cause she's fighting for by making the whole thing a circus? Now, the Swedish climate change activist was arrested today after joining hundreds of protesters who gathered to denounce the Energy Intelligence Forum, dubbed the Oscars of Oil, which is a gathering of energy company bosses at a 5-star hotel on London's Park Lane. Is she ruining it for everybody? Charlotte?
Well, we're certainly talking about the issue of climate change because of it, aren't we?
Are we?
Well, everything you've just said there about the Energy Intelligence Forum, it's certainly meaning that people are asking questions about these things. I think when it comes to a lot of the actions of these sorts of groups, I'm not necessarily condoning it, and there are certainly actions that they've taken that I absolutely condemn, but I think we do need to get more serious as a country in talking more about climate change with the urgency that it deserves.
Rachel?
I mean, I agree. I mean, she has brought the subject, and she's really made it, front page news. She's front page news. I mean, a part of me is asking, how did she get to London? Of course, because she can't fly. Did she go by? I don't know how
She's got very strong arms.
Did she row? Did she row? But I think more power to her elbow. I think it was stupid of the police to arrest her. It just encourages more protesters to do more obstructive protests in the cause of, I think this one was called Free Oil, what was it called? Fossil Free London protester. Anyway, I didn't know about the Fossil Free London, but I'm sure they've got laudable aims, which are, to save our grandchildren from rising sea levels.
You just think your dad's listening, don't you?
No, I don't say things because I think my dad's listening. Of course he is. He's he's been the first jolly green giant I ever knew.
Well, and he is a great environmental campaigner, but he doesn't need to do these.
Yeah, he dressed up he dressed up in a penguin outfit once and marched through the streets of Ottawa, and I think was maybe arrested himself. So I know of what I speak. This draws attention to the issue, and we need to pay attention collectively and individually to it.
Yeah, I think as a media strategy, it's very effective. I know everybody hates Just Stop Oil, and everybody condemns Just Stop Oil, and everybody says, oh, they're turning people against the cause. I don't buy it at all. I think I agree with all of those statements, except for they keep it in the news, and actually I think that is a much more effective strategy than it not being in the news, and they probably quite enjoy winding everyone up and everyone hating them, or maybe they don't like it, but either way, I think as a media strategy, I do think it works, yeah.
Harriett Baldwin.
Well, I mean, I'm obviously going to say that I think they have harmed their cause, Just Stop Oil. I think, though, that it's really important that we focus on getting to net zero by 2050, and we'll only do that if businesses and capitalists, and Greta may not like this, but, that there's innovation and investment from the private sector to solve this problem. And I don't think that's something that one should try to thwart. I think that's something one should try to encourage.
Right, let's move on to our dreaded fun question at the end of the hour. It's from Rob in Southampton. A new chilli, Pepper X, has been named the hottest in the world according to the Guinness Book of World Records. What's your worst spicy food fail? Has a spicy sauce sent you straight for the sick bucket, or even worse? Harriett, you love.
Okay, I've got a very good tip for listeners from personal experience. With an average chilli, do not cut up a chilli and then later in the day think you can take your contact lenses out without causing massive pain. So, particularly with this new chilli, I would recommend wear plastic gloves to do it.
Charlotte?
Probably my worst. I remember going to a Vietnamese restaurant in Manchester a couple of years ago, and they sort of said about the pho. They were like, "Do you like it spicy?" And I was like, "Yeah, I like spicy food." Honestly, I thought I was bleeding out of my eyes. It was so much hotter than anything I've had previously, and I consider myself to be someone who, it's not like I'm getting a lemon and herb at Nando's. Do you know what I mean? I like a bit of spice, but that was far too much.
You just described me there, Rachel.
I don't like them super hot, and all I can say in this funny moment is that whatever I make at home, and I speak as a finalist in Celebrity Best Home Cook on BBC One, whatever I make and put in front of my husband, he gets up, he leaves the plate of food cooling, and he goes to our store cupboard and tries to find any like chili sauce, any sweet and sour sauce, and they've got a whole cupboard full of what he calls take the taste away sauces, so that
is yours cooking that bad?
No, my cooking is great, but he likes a spicy condiment, so this is one for him.
Yeah, I'm going to have to sign up to Mr. Johnson's approach here.
He's not called Mr. Johnson.
Sorry, I took a punt.
Although he could have taken my name. It's been very modern of him.
Yeah, right, absolutely. I'm all power to him.
You didn't take his, did you?
Well...
Or do you in certain aspects of your life?
When the kids were at school and I had to take them to hospital, I was definitely that, Mrs. No rather than Rachel Johnson.
Okay.
Just so I had the same name as them.
Which is nice.
Yeah.
It's nice to end the show on a happy note.
Exactly.
Given the news that we've been talking about all evening. Now, tomorrow's panel on Cross Question, the Rabbi and Assisted Dying campaigner, Dr. Jonathan Romain, the Vice President of the business lobby group, the CBI, Lord Karen Billamoria, plus representatives from the Conservative and Labour parties whose identity is either secret or we don't know who they are yet. I think it's possibly the latter. Right, in the next hour, we were going to talk about financial scams, but given the news this evening that up to 800 people have been killed in a rocket attack, I use that word advisedly, on a hospital in Gaza, I think we should talk about that. We're going to be joined by our correspondent live in Israel just after the news. I'm going to ask you, how will this change the conflict in Israel and Gaza? Because at the moment, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is saying, nothing to do with us, Gov. It was a Hamas rocket that went wrong that killed these people. Let's get your reaction to that in just a moment here on LBC. 0345 6060 973.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, the World Health Organization